Good morning, everybody, and many thanks for joining us today for our webinar on human rights due diligence in supply chains. This webinar is part of a series for the Commonwealth 8.7 network, and the aim being to enlighten, share knowledge, exchange experience, and hopefully incentivize change to move us closer to the goal of achieving SDG target 8.7, which I'm sure you all know is focused on ending forced labour, human trafficking, and child labour. Today, we hope to provide you with a useful and interesting series of presentations to provide background information and hopefully resources also for you to better understand this rather niche area of labour exploitation in business supply chains. And also, of course, the role of human rights due diligence in stopping it. We can see from the registrations that there are a number of our members from the network who will be participating today, and that also there are a number of external participants. You're all very welcome, and I do hope that this won't be the first nor the last time for you. By way of introduction, my name is Siobhan Scanlon. I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm currently working for the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, known also as CHRI. The CHRI is the host for this event because they have the role as Secretariat for the Commonwealth 8.7 network. And just for those of you who aren't network members, the network is a civil society network of over 80 organisations across the globe, which was formed approximately 4 years ago. And all of these organisations share a common goal of ending contemporary forms of slavery. Now, today we have 3 speakers lined up. We hope to illuminate this topic for us and to provide pointers as to where we need to be going to getting closer to achieving these SDG targets. To start with, we have Kelly Beaker. Hello, Kelly. She is co-founder and executive director of the Cannabis Education Guild, which is an enterprise working for global cannabis education and social impact. Kelly has had an important role in the development of the Canadian cannabis industry since 2015, and she helps businesses design socially responsible strategies to succeed in this sector. Kelly will be kicking off the discussion, looking at the exploitation of workers in the production of cash crops and the measures being taken to ensure that the same destructive systems are not replicated in the legalised cannabis sector. She'll also introduce us, I hope, to the notion of due diligence assessments for businesses involved in cannabis production and supply. I will then be picking up from Kelly's presentation, changing from my moderator hat to speaker hat, and looking at what happened in the supply chains of personal protective equipment during the COVID pandemic. I'll be mainly drawing on the findings from recent research published by CHRI on this topic. And finally, last to speak, but definitely not least, is Dr. Stephen Morse, the founder and CEO of Unchained Solutions Pty Limited, a Sydney-based company advising Australian companies on compliance with the recent Australian Modern Slavery Act from 2018. Stephen will be taking a closer look at what human rights due diligence actually means in practice with a focus on Australia. And he'll be looking at the most effective ways of achieving results in the elimination of forced labour from supply, alongside providing remedies for victims. So, with no further ado, let me hand over to Kelly. And just to help structure what Kelly, I hope, will be presenting for us, I have asked her to answer 3 questions for us. And these are the following. What is it about cash crops that means that labour exploitation tends to thrive? What is different about cannabis production so that this won't be the case? And what do we mean by human rights due diligence, and how does it feature in the cannabis sector? So thank you very much, and over to you, Kelly.
Thank you for that wonderful intro, Siobhan, and it's such an honor to be here with everyone from all around the world. I will just share my screen so we can pull up the slides. Okay, here we go. So, as Siobhan mentioned, I'm going to be diving into cash crops with a focus on cannabis and understanding how there's a continued pattern that we're seeing specifically in agriculture, and how cannabis has an opportunity to really be a disruptor in the way we treat humans, in the way we have higher standards, and in a new way of operating. We'll focus on the risks, why we must act now, and really the greater opportunity. So my goal today is to shift perspective for those of you who are not currently living in a legal cannabis market. Maybe you think of it still as an illicit drug, something small in a little baggie. We need to see it as a global commodity that's going to be produced in biomass, in bulk, all around the world and traded everywhere. As Siobhan mentioned, I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Cannabis Education Guild, and really my mission, working with some of the largest licensed producers and now independently, has been to educate people, from doctors to members of government to patients to farmers, not only about the benefits of the plant from medical to industrial, but the actual new way of working, the opportunities of creating an ethical supply chain. So something to wrap your head around is that cannabis is the most widely used drug and most cultivated drug around the world. It's grown in 151 different countries. So that's more than any other drug in the world, and very high for any type of crop. So as I was saying, starting to wrap our heads around this idea that cannabis will be a cash crop, a commodity, one of the most significant ones to watch over the next decade, as we're seeing more and more countries come on board and legalize it. Starting to draw a parallel between cannabis and agriculture, rather than just seeing it as an illicit, underground legacy market. It's now becoming part of the agriculture sector. In the US, we've already seen it surpass in value rice and peanuts. So starting to frame it as an agricultural crop, we can see the risks, like in high-risk crops of coffee, tea, cotton, sugar. Those crops tend to be high risk because they're either in higher risk countries where labor protection is low, or they're subject to workers who are migrants, undocumented, children, they're from marginalized communities. And agriculture is such an economic driver in every country. We all need food. And it seems to be that it's often migrants or people from marginalized communities that tend to work in the space and are taken advantage of. And as we're starting to see the collapse of the North American industry, because it's very expensive to grow cannabis indoors, and we see the shift of people starting to grow in Asia and Africa, the risk is that this same pattern of unfair treatment, of exploitation of land, of exploitation of communities will continue, so that we can harvest the crop for pennies on the ground and trade it around the world. So really, we're at a pivotal moment in time where the world is starting to change their attitudes, and cannabis laws will change. We're also at a pivotal time for modern slavery. As many of you know who are here and well-versed on the subject, there are over, I'm sure, more than 40 million people existing in some form of modern slavery today, and 200 million victims of those are children. 70% of those 200 million work in the agricultural sector. So this number is very triggering to me as someone who's worked with kids in Southeast Asia for a lot of my life. I see how they're easily susceptible to go work in a farm, undocumented, paid or unpaid. And my fear is that, as countries continue to legalize and move at a very rapid pace without regulations for companies, whether they're multinational or domestic, children and laborers will not be protected. No country or sector is free of modern slavery. It exists in every corner of the world, with right now Asia and Europe having the highest prevalence. I also don't love this number. We commonly see this number that forced labor generates 150 billion per year. That stat was from the UN International Labor Organization in 2014, and we have not yet seen it updated as far as I know. If anyone has seen it updated and there's a report, please throw it in the chat. But if we can say that in 2014, that was the estimate, I think it's fair to assume it's at least doubled. So why cannabis? Why now? We see that there's a problem with coffee, with tea, with cotton, with all these cash crops. Why should we focus on cannabis? It's nothing new. As much as it seems radical that in this lifetime we're going to see cannabis traded globally around the world, for over 70 years, people have been growing, consuming, trading cannabis while it was illegal. Today, as laws are changing, over 50 countries have legalized cannabis in some form, and 15 of those are in the Commonwealth. So we're definitely starting to see it happen at a more rapid pace. One of the catalysts for this movement has been the UN removing cannabis from the list of the most dangerous substances. So once that happened in December 2020, a bunch of countries, including Muslim countries, Morocco, like countries that we never thought would have any policy change, started to amend policy to allow for some form of cannabis. Can everyone see my screen? I just popped up that participants can now see your screen. I'm assuming that we're still good. Okay. This stat helps you to wrap your mind around from crop to cash crop, seeing that it's projected that within the next 5 years, the industry might be worth around $90 billion. And this includes hemp for industrial purposes. And this will also help you wrap your head around moving beyond just cannabis in, a drug form, illegal in a little baggie. There are over 25,000 different products today that are already being made from cannabis. So this includes fashion, it's a fabric, building materials. In Nepal, they're using hempcrete, which is actually an excellent and more sustainable type of insulation for housing. Animal feed, it's obviously much more better for the land to use hemp as an animal feed rather than using meat or processed foods. It's very good for the soil. It's very good for the environment. Hemp actually regenerates soil. Food, there's hemp seed in the seed form, there's hemp milk, there's oil. It's a wonderful source of protein and omegas. Medical cannabis, obviously in a bunch of different formats, from IV drip to inhalers, dissolving tablets. So just really wrapping your head around the many different types of formats and how much product will be required to serve a global medical market within hospitals and clinics around the world. And of course, in some countries, surprisingly, we are seeing adult use where, in places like Canada, California, Uruguay, Thailand, you can now walk into retail stores and purchase cannabis as if you were purchasing alcohol, like it's a recreational product. And this comes in an array of formats, from chocolates to gummies to oil cartridge pens and so on. So with all of that starting to take the shift from an illicit product to a global commodity, there comes great threats and risks, of course, because it's in agriculture, but also for several other reasons. It's becoming a consumer packaged good. So it's disrupting alcohol, tobacco, wellness, all these sectors where cannabis, CBD, different cannabinoids, different compounds of the plant are like an ingredient that will go into these different categories of products. So of course, as we need more labor across the cannabis supply chain, we have to think about how we're going to keep people above profits. We've seen whether it's in, can I move myself down here. Whether it's in the seafood sector in Thailand, Siobhan will touch on the PPE. Canada was definitely guilty of sourcing PPE from terrible factories that did not put humans above profits. The whole Xinjiang cotton scandal, the cheaper the good and the higher the demand, to me is the pattern of these haphazardly built supply chains and where there is great risk. Oh, I missed something here. And just to note, the key players that are running the cannabis industry today already have bad practices. They're drug trafficking, they're human trafficking, they're doing whatever they can to create an industry that still thrives and is still thriving even in legal markets. So some areas of focus and concern are definitely the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, the Golden Crescent in South Asia around India and Nepal, and the Emerald Triangle, which is California. Northern California has had hundreds of instances of lawsuits against legal companies with issues of forced labor. So some of those key players were already in the illicit market and transitioned to legal. They got their license, they started their farm, and they continued that bad practice. So as I was saying, there's already been a lot of instances in the UK, in North America, in Lesotho, South Africa, California, where some cannabis companies are now facing lawsuits because of how they're treating their workers, whether they've been trafficked, whether they're living in terrible working conditions. There's been a few deaths in California. It's ongoing. So if the problem has already started and we don't have regulations and standards, we are fair to assume it will follow the same pattern as other cash crops. So we really have a moment now. So as I mentioned, the industry itself, it's very manual, it's very labor intensive. And so as the supply and demand of cannabis grows, the workforce will expand and we will see a demand for cheaper labor. So what excites me and keeps me going is that we don't have to follow the same patterns of fast fashion or fast food or big pharma. We can actually do things differently and learn from lessons. So I didn't have a list of the Commonwealth countries, but for the G20 countries, it's quite limited in those who already have any type of public procurement protections in place for supply chains. Canada still does not have a Modern Slavery Act. It's humiliating, and there's nothing in place to govern our supply chains. So we can be sourcing PPE from Malaysia or, seafood from Thailand and not have any type of protection in place to ensure that there's any kind of check, either domestically or internationally. So cannabis can really take a new way of working, operating as a sector, creating a higher standard for labor protection. And while we write the regulations today, why not include something about labor protection in the policies that will govern the crop and do things like a sector rather than trying, each country has their own act or they don't, and there is no real governance of the chain of custody of a product. So I'll leave you with this thought to ponder. We're at this critical moment in time. We need to really ask, how is the industry and the policymakers going to choose to operate? We can only try and do better so that we can see a higher standard in how we treat people, hopefully putting people above profits. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sticking around on the webinar to listen to our other speakers. Here's my contact information. If anyone would like to get in touch or has questions after the talk, please feel free to reach out. Oh, you're on mute, Siobhan. Hold on. Just unmute
There we
yourself.
are.
Yeah,
I'm
there we go.
unmuted. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Excellent. A really interesting overview of the whole burgeoning cannabis sector. Lots of things to digest there. In terms of the overview of questions, you very much managed to summarize why cash crops tend to have a sort of a number of coinciding factors which lead to exploitation of different types of vulnerable communities, typically drawn to agricultural work. And in terms of how cannabis production might be doing it differently in order not to fall into the same traps that we've seen in other agricultural sectors, you've clearly indicated they're not necessarily for the moment doing it any differently, that you've even got criminal gangs involved in other forms of criminality who've been maybe traditionally involved in this sector when it was illegal, and even though now legalized, practicing similar methods, I suppose, of recruitment and enforcement in terms of work. So still obviously a lot to do. In terms of due diligence, you've sort of touched on that slightly, to the extent that, as you've said, Canada doesn't have yet its own Modern Slavery Act, which would require then companies obviously to make these assessments as a result of legal obligation, as opposed to maybe voluntary schemes that Canadian companies might already adhere to. So maybe they are conducting certain amounts of due diligence. But anyway, we'll come back to more of that, obviously, both with what I'll be saying in the next presentation and with what Stephen will be telling us in the final presentation. So let me move on to me now. As I've said, I'm changing from moderator to presenter. So I'd like to hand my screen over to you. Okay. So let me also. Okay. All right. Okay. I'll have to. So let me begin. The three questions that I want to use to frame what I want to present to you now are the following. What has happened in the supply chains of PPE during the pandemic? How did the state and private sector respond? And are corporate efforts to eliminate forced labour in supply chains effective? And what needs to change in this regard? So as I mentioned in my introduction already, I wanted to draw, in fact, on the findings from recent CHRI research on this topic, which was conducted between September 2020 to July 2022. It was essentially a desk-based review of media and academia, and limited itself to looking at supply chains of personal protective equipment between Malaysia and Australia. The title of the research you can see there at the bottom of the screen: Global Supply Chains and COVID-19, Exposing Exploitation in the Personal Protective Equipment Sector in Malaysia and Australia. The research, of course, is available on our website if you want to come back to it after today and look for further detail in there. The research, by way of background to the research, as you all know, there was a huge spike in demand for PPE during the pandemic, as of course entire nations were required to wear face masks, and also healthcare and frontline workers were reliant on gloves, masks, gowns, etc. to protect themselves and others from becoming infected from the virus. In March 2020 already, WHO issued a call to governments to ramp up the manufacturing of PPE by 40%, saying that shortages were leaving doctors, nurses and other frontline workers dangerously ill-equipped to care for COVID patients. And then the WHO Director General also, with specific reference obviously to the supply chains, urged that secure supply chains be provided so that the risk to healthcare workers around the world wasn't exacerbated, recognising that it wasn't possible to stop COVID without protecting health workers first, and they were dependent obviously on PPE. Needless to say, prices for PPE surged during this time, and companies and individuals wanting to cash in and get in board with, lucrative PPE production and supply sometimes reared their ugly heads. In the UK, the whole manner in which PPE contracts were awarded to the friends and family of essentially conservative politicians is still mired, in fact, in scandal today. This, of course, isn't relevant to today's discussion, but I just wanted to add a little local colour since I'm based here in the UK. And my local MP, in fact, was none other than the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who was accused of awarding multiple contracts of PPE to friends and family. But what is relevant for today's discussion is really what was happening to the workers in the manufacturing of PPE. So coming to Malaysia, which was, as I say, the focus of our research, it's home to rubber glove manufacturing and is the world's largest exporter of medical gloves. The sector relies on up to 30,000 plus foreign migrant workers, frequently from countries such as Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, who are producing an estimated 200 billion gloves for export. Already before the pandemic, there was knowledge about the exploitative working conditions facing Malaysia's migrant workforce. Numerous investigations had indicated that the working conditions in some of this manufacturing sector met international definitions of forced labour. And as the slide here shows, the evidence of forced labour even led to a wholesale US ban on the import of Malaysian gloves. So just to divert for one moment and to provide a few definitions which are relevant to the study. What is forced labour? Firstly, just to mention that the CHRI report, and of course also the SDG 8.7, refer to modern slavery or contemporary forms of slavery. I just want to flag up that neither of those terms, which are the terms in actual fact that the Australian and the UK legislation, which have modern slavery acts, which has been pointed out to by Kelly, those terms are used in those national legislations. But these terms aren't defined under an international instrument, but they are umbrella terms for terms that are defined under international instruments, which I've highlighted here on this slide, 3 terms which are relevant to this particular research, which are internationally defined. So we have forced labour, which is defined under the ILO Forced Labour Convention 1930, number 29. We've got trafficking in human beings, of course, defined under the Palermo Protocol, and then debt bondage, which relates to a definition from 1956 from the UN Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery. So now back to what was happening in Malaysia and what were workers reporting during the pandemic in the production of PPE. So from information that was provided by interviews with some of these individuals in press reports, not only were they reporting long hours for inadequate compensation, sometimes wages being withheld, passports being confiscated, living and working conditions insufferable, but also that many had paid recruitment agencies extortionate sums for job placements and were labouring therefore in situations of debt bondage, so unable basically to repay obviously their debt from the work they were doing, and therefore not free to leave the workplace. And I've included here just a couple of quotes from the report in relation to some of those findings, which specify, in fact, a number of manufacturers, a couple of manufacturers that were key glove manufacturers, important also for their exports to Australia, one being Top Glove that's referred to there, and the other one WRP factories. So let me move on now to the next question. I think we've sort of covered what was happening in the supply chains of PPE during the pandemic. So what did the state and private sector do to respond to these reports of what was happening in the PPE sector? And to answer this question, firstly, I want to look at Malaysia and ask, what should states and businesses be doing in Malaysia? Now, Under international human rights law, states have an obligation to protect against human rights abuses perpetrated by third parties, including business enterprises operating within their territory. They are required to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate crimes of trafficking and forced labour, and punish individuals and legal persons found guilty of those acts. So this response by the state is relating to, obviously, the enforcement of criminal law. Now, the research found that although there is obviously an anti-trafficking act in Malaysia, which is noted there on the slide, and there are anti-trafficking task forces active in Malaysia as well, that although this anti-trafficking task force raided a number of organisations that were suspected of conditions of forced labour in their factories, they found no evidence of forced labour and no action was taken. To balance this somewhat, on the other hand, you had labour inspectors obviously not enforcing criminal law, but enforcing the relevant health and safety laws or employment laws of the country. They did fine a number of key manufacturers for PPE, finding that there were insanitary and inhumane working conditions. But what was lacking in this was that those efforts by the labour inspectors didn't trigger any alarm bells for the anti-trafficking task forces that would have obviously led to the enforcement of the criminal law against the relevant employers. So in many respects, therefore, the state's criminal law enforcement was pretty ineffective. Beyond criminal law, of course, the next possible course of action relates to the title of today's discussion, which is due diligence. Now, the sources of this due diligence requirement is reflected in the ILO protocol of 2014 to the 1930 Forced Labour Convention. And under the ILO protocol, states are required to support due diligence by both the public and private sectors, so by both in public procurement and also by private businesses, to prevent and respond to risks of forced labour. Due diligence should include assessing actual and potential human rights impacts, integrating and acting upon the findings, tracking the responses, and communicating how those impacts are addressed. And it's important to note also here that impact relates not only to an enterprise's own activities, for which obviously it has direct control, but also relates to those to which it might be linked through business relationships, i.e. supply chains. So in the context of this research, due diligence assessments were a responsibility for the relevant businesses, therefore, both in Malaysia and in Australia. Now, in Malaysia, manufacturers conducted their own assessments because they don't have a Modern Slavery Act requiring businesses to conduct due diligence assessments in relation to their supply chains and the like. But many companies, of course, adhere to certification schemes, or what are called multi-stakeholder initiatives, which require that they do conduct these assessments. So many labour audits, as they're entitled, were conducted in Malaysia under these voluntary certification schemes. But it needs to be noted that the audits are conducted by third parties who, of course, are paid for, so who are instructed and paid for by the actual manufacturers who are engaged in the possible forced labour practices. But if, of course, these audits were to be done perhaps independently and properly, they should result in detecting situations or indicators of forced labour and trafficking. But the research found that in actual fact, many of these private labour audits that were of manufacturers that were suspected of forced labour didn't result in any negative findings. And in fact, on the contrary, often they resulted in glowing reports of the compliance of the particular country or the particular manufacturer with human rights and labour standards. And so clearly a complete diversion from the truth. Maybe we can move on to the next slide. I just wanted to point out here that not only were audits glowing, there's an example from the report here that many of the audits were directly corrupted, where you see that in the first example on the slide, that employees, in fact, were told by the company as to how they would be answering in the labour audits, to provide positive feedback in relation to working and living conditions. And there were plenty of other examples of the way in which audits were corrupted in this manner. Now, moving on to Australia's response. Under the Modern Slavery Act of Australia, as has already been mentioned, there is a responsibility to conduct these human rights due diligence assessments and to essentially submit what are called modern slavery statements. And this is something that I'll very much leave Stephen to discuss in greater detail. But suffice just to note that during the pandemic, some Australian companies, of course, continue to import PPE from these very same Malaysian suppliers that were notable for their forced labour practices. But one might therefore reasonably think that therefore these companies were not actually assessing and reporting on the risks of violations in their supply chains in accordance with the Australian Modern Slavery Act, because otherwise they clearly wouldn't have been able to be getting away with this. But in actual fact, what the research found was that some such companies that were reporting from organisations breaching standards in Malaysia did in actual fact submit their modern slavery statements to the relevant register in Australia, and that even some of these statements recognised that there were plenty of reports of human rights violations within their supply chain. But still, these companies continue to import from those same manufacturers that were exploiting workers, and they incurred neither penalty nor sanction, it appears, from the Australian authorities. And here, what we have on the slide, just to give an example, a statement by one of the Australian PP suppliers, Ansell, who is importing from Top Glove, who it's already been noted from the previous slide was actually part of the subject to the US ban. Top Glove was actually noted in that US ban on gloves, medical gloves. But in terms of trying to, I suppose, limit its exposure to criticism, it writes in its statement that in line with best practice guidance on remediation, we've been engaging with these suppliers who were known to be potentially exploiting their workers on how to improve their approach and are monitoring their performance closely through regular discussions. And so we continue to engage with these suppliers and note that it's complex and systemic, etc. And will take time and multi-party collaboration to fully address, etc., etc. So yeah, basically no immediate action was taken, seemingly by them, to stop the use of those suppliers in their chains. But as I said, it seems that they weren't sanctioned either by the Australian state agencies for potentially being complicit in the use of forced labour in the supply of PPE. Which leaves one, of course, to wonder what, therefore, the value of this Modern Slavery Act and the role of corporate due diligence, where there is seemingly no teeth to actually tackle instances of forced labour in supply chains, or even more so, provide any sort of remedy to those who are victims of that type of exploitation. Which therefore leads me to the last question. Are corporate efforts to eliminate forced labour in supply chains effective, and what needs to change? I mean, from the examples given above and basing my conclusion only really on what this research has indicated, clearly there are serious gaps, both in the corporate sense, but also in the state response. And the state is implicated, of course, in Malaysia in terms of the failure of its even anti-trafficking task forces to adequately enforce its criminal law, but also the state agencies in Australia, in that there is an Australian Modern Slavery Act, and in order for it to really serve a purpose, it shouldn't seemingly just provide for a tick box exercise, it seems, for business, which seems to be the conclusion from the research for this report. So what needs to change? I've taken a selection here of recommendations from the report. There's obviously many more recommendations we've made to both countries and to businesses. And what I wanted just to focus on was essentially 4 recommendations to states, which looks at enhancing this legislation on transparency. Of course, for the moment, there is only 2 states within the Commonwealth, which is correct, Kelly, on your slide, the UK and Australia, who have legislation requiring this reporting on modern slavery in their supply chains. But even there, we know that there are serious limitations with it. But nevertheless, firstly, recommending that legislation should be enhanced, and it should require companies to disclose actual measures adopted to tackle trafficking in persons and forced labour in their supply chains. And I wanted just to add that such measures, these measures also should address at the minimum also recruitment practices and the use of alternative sources of information to supplement audit information, which should also take into account issues such as the quality of complaints or grievance mechanisms that are available within a particular manufacturer for workers, and coordination with other relevant stakeholders, including trade unions and civil society representatives in terms of assessing the actual situation on the ground. No, can I go back? Sorry, Malvika, I hadn't finished with the countries. And legislation covering recruitment activities should also be a specific target, which would be further in compliance with the international standards on recruitment activities, which prohibits the charging of recruitment fees and related costs to workers and job seekers. Because as we saw, that the situation in Malaysia was very much tied up for many migrant workers with situations of debt bondage to those recruiters. Also, the importance of the Labour Inspectorate here, that it's efficient and sufficiently resourced to detect situations of human trafficking and forced labour, and then equally to be able to refer and to work with other law enforcement agencies in terms of criminal law implementation too, which seems to be lacking in Malaysia. And then regarding grievance mechanisms, remembering that at the bottom of this there are individuals who have basically been abused, exploited, and not fairly compensated for everything that they have done. So to ensure that that workers have affordable access to grievance and dispute resolution mechanisms, so they can address these abuses and fraudulent practices in employment and recruitment. And then finally, to businesses, what should change? Next slide. Yes, is that companies should adopt company policies on the elimination of human trafficking and forced labour from the supply chain, and adhere to certification programs or multi-stakeholder initiatives that address human trafficking and forced labour. So these provisions obviously would allow for situations in countries where there are no legal obligations to conduct due diligence on supply chains, which covers pretty much most of the globe. Certification programs and multi-stakeholder initiatives should also, of course, target the quality of the audits that are conducted in relation to those schemes, ensuring that auditors have the capacity to detect trafficking and forced labour and risks of unethical recruitment, and equally that those audits will also rely on external sources of information, as I've already mentioned, by trade unions or civil society representatives that are also familiar with the conditions of work in that particular territory. And that finally companies should participate in grievance mechanisms again to ensure that victims have got access to compensation, and cooperate with local and national authorities in referring situations of trafficking or forced labour to those authorities. So thank you very much. That's where I would like to end. Again, maybe we'll put a link to the report actually in the chat. I saw that there was a question come in on that, so that you'll be able to access that. But otherwise, as I said, the report is available on the CHRI website. So let me end there now and return finally to Stephen to finalise today's session. Stephen, as I said, is the expert on Australia. I hope I haven't spoken too out of turn in relation to what I've been saying about the findings from this research in relation to some Australian companies. I'm sure it's not all like that, Stephen. But anyway, what I have asked perhaps you to think about, Stephen, in your overview now is the following three questions. What do companies really do in Australia when they conduct due diligence assessments? And does the Modern Slavery Act just allow for a tick box exercise? I'm sure it doesn't really. So please just enlighten us a little bit further as to what does it really ask for, and how does it do that? And to do due diligence properly, i.e. to eliminate forced labour in supply chains, which is what we're all about, how does due diligence need to be done? Okay, over to you, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Siobhan. Well, I hope I can do justice to that. Thank you for the introduction and the segue into the Australian situation. Let me just get my screen organized so that everyone can see that. So yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and it's very late for me, so I'll do what I can. Oh, that's going to do that automatically. That's no good. So just a little bit introduction to who I am. I run Unchained Solutions. We're a consultancy based in Sydney, Australia, and we work with organizations, both large and small, to help them to comply with this Modern Slavery Act that's been articulated already for us today. We have a turnkey solution offering a range of strategies for organizations to help them to comply regardless of their level of maturity with the legislation and their size and their reporting requirements. Because what we see here in Australia, which is a positive step, is that whilst there are entities, over thousands of entities that are submitting statements to the government, there is a knock-on effect in the market, and so smaller players, SMEs, and even not-for-profits who fall under the threshold of reporting, so that's an annual consolidated revenue of over 100 million in Australian dollars. They too are needing to step up as they're being tapped on the shoulder and receiving, for example, a self-assessment questionnaire or a vendor agreement which has a line that says, "We are attending to modern slavery due diligence." So that's the sticky point for many organizations as part of the broader ESG reporting landscape. So that's even a massive category. So modern slavery really just sits within a niche section or under social and human rights reporting as part of a larger ESG framework, which many organizations are also attending to as well. So I think probably coming just as an initial thought, probably some of the lack of due diligence that is occurring in the space at the moment, as we've seen probably in the last 12 months, is really in respects to many other impact areas that organizations are attending to here in Australia, notably climate change, anything to do with COP27, responsible sourcing of energy and waste management are big issues here, as well as attending to Indigenous affairs, which are all relevant and justifiable impact areas that need to be addressed as well. So I don't want to dismiss the great work that organizations are doing. So just really briefly, just to kind of give a really rough idea of what is a Modern Slavery Act about, and really it's about two things, probably three concepts, but let's just work with the two. Really, it's about transparency and responsibility. They're the key kind of words. So when we look at the reporting requirements of the Modern Slavery Act here in Australia, there's 7 criteria. And a lot of the work is really done in sort of stage 3, 4, and 5. 3 is about actually describing the risks of modern slavery to your operations and to your supply chain, and being transparent about that. So point 3 is about transparency, being willing to actually engage with the issues of risk, as well as then being transparent in terms of your own reporting to the government of what those risks are, and facing whatever reputational risk may be there because of that. The second piece is number 4, and that is once you've taken responsibility. So once you've been transparent, then it's to take responsibility. And so organizations then need to demonstrate how they're going to take responsibility. What might that look like from a governance framework perspective in terms of a policy portfolio, and how those policies are improved and socialized within the organization, as well as what other mechanisms are set up in terms of due diligence around a grievance mechanism, for example, remediation strategy, assessing and working with suppliers in a sense to improve business practices and taking responsibility for the supply of goods and services. And fifthly, then the other word that I haven't mentioned yet is around effectiveness. And so companies need to, in all the work that they're doing, all the activity, need to be able to demonstrate that what they're doing is actually making an impact, and the intended impact, and they actually have an impact strategy around that, with goals and impact areas assigned, outputs and projected outcomes. And they're measuring not just the quantitative components, but also the qualitative components of actually what they're doing. This, in a sense, summarizes the reporting mechanism and is the kind of the centerpiece, really, of the legislation. How does this all rolling out in terms of the market? Well, the Modern Slavery Act has been in play here since, well, it was enacted in 2018, but really it's been in place since 2019. And over the last 3 and 4 years, we've really seen a breadth of responses to the legislation. We saw an initial flurry of excitement and a sense of urgency in the market. And we saw many big players who are listed companies really taking a leading role, which was great. Many of whom have a very clear and discernible consumer face. So they're very notable companies, particularly in financial services and the supermarkets, for example, the mining sector as well. But as we've gone on, and particularly as we've moved into sort of companies that are not necessarily so recognizable, who may be more embedded within the B2B supply chain space in terms of the landscape here in Australia, there has been a range of responses, and I'm even aware and in contact with organizations who officially should be reporting but have not actually done anything to date. And I'm still confused as to why nothing has been done in that regard, as to why they're actually not being tapped on the shoulder by the Australian Border Force in order to comply. One of the key words in the legislation, which I think may have contributed to this, is the term reasonable steps, which I know is a recognizable term in terms of human rights due diligence. They're taking reasonable steps to ensure that the risk of modern slavery is not prevalent in the supply of goods and services. But I think this terminology in the business world has been interpreted as perhaps more of a choose your own adventure kind of experience, where organizations are in a sense being driven by the market. And the legislation, one of the key weaknesses of the legislation has been in letting the market drive a race to the top, which actually has led to a race to the middle. And that's led to a variety of responses and probably limitations in terms of the kind of work that organizations have been doing. There's been a number of reports that have come out, including reports that we've produced in conjunction with Macquarie University, who we're in partnership with here in Sydney, reports by the International Justice Mission, Monash University, and the Human Rights Law Centre based in Australia. And the reports really, when we look at all the reports and we sort of consider some of the there's been some key themes that have come out from the reports that have been produced over the last couple of years in terms of what is, I suppose, what are the main gaps? What are the main, what is lacking in terms of the response, the corporate response? And we could probably summarize them in 4 ways, and it's not limited to these 4, but these would be 4 main areas of gaps in modern slavery due diligence. One has to do with the lack of supplier risk assessment beyond direct suppliers, and perhaps even some confusion about what is a supplier, what constitutes a supplier. Perhaps when we think about, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, for example, the situation is such that a lot of the work that's been done in Australia for many organizations is really to map out the suppliers for whom they buy from. So those entities they're buying directly from that are largely based in Australia, some are based overseas and they source directly from overseas. But what is often the case here is those suppliers are not technically suppliers. They're often distributors or wholesalers, aggregators, retailers, and it can be fair to say that many of their operations are low risk, particularly if they're based in Australia. And it's one of the dangers then is to think, well, my risk is low because the risk among my direct suppliers is low, and they're not actually thinking through, well, actually, I need to be drilling down further. Now, many of our organizations have adopted a methodology, a more algorithmic methodology, where they're actually pinpointing where risks might be in different parts of the world. And I think there's been a lot of value in that to actually at least realize that the risks of modern slavery are going to be beyond those direct suppliers. One of the challenges there, though, is actually not getting to the specifics of risks of the risks, and that's actually a key component, I think, to modern slavery due diligence is to get to the context, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Second to that is around a lack of stakeholder engagement for capacity building. So as organizations have assessed risk, then some of them been very quick to issue a self-assessment questionnaire for suppliers by email. Just fill in this form and declare for yourself where you stand on a number of key policies or positions or due diligence activities. One of the weaknesses here then is around suppliers not taking that seriously enough. But I think the whole approach has not been done well, and I think a lot more has needed to be done to actually engage with suppliers. And good practice in this space is where entities have actually taken control of the situation by actually inviting stakeholders, suppliers into a forum to actually articulate the meaning of a supplier code of conduct, the meaning of a supplier self-assessment questionnaire, expectations around auditing and what auditing should look like. What kind of certifications would actually benefit the supplier, and ways in which the reporting entity, by demonstrating leadership, can actually resource those suppliers. Fourth area is around a lack of clear remediation strategy. So there's a lot of theories and theoretical work around remediation, but by not attending to the actual specifics of risk, then it's been very difficult for companies to actually identify where they can actually remediate effectively. And finally, then a lack of clear metrics to measure effectiveness. And many organizations have, not really thought through the ecosystem in which they operate and where they sit in the business landscape and where they can actually leverage change and affect change in the space. Those are the kind of things that they can actually measure. Many organizations want to simply minimize modern slavery risk, but they sit so far up the supply chain that they really have no leverage or influence to do much. And so they need to be thinking a lot more strategically about where they can influence, where they can affect change in terms of the whole ecosystem. A clear example of one of the weaknesses occurred back in May 2022 with the arrest of the shipping of the ship AG Neptune, which was a fuel ship. The arrest was made off the port of Newcastle in the state of New South Wales, where I'm based. This ship is Liberian owned. It was chartered by Vital, and the ship's fuel was being owned by Viva Energy, which is based in Australia and elsewhere. The ship had been refueled in Taiwan before coming into Australian waters. The problems emerged from the port of Gladstone in Queensland when it was noted by Viva Energy that the fuel had been contaminated by seawater. And that's when the red flags emerged. It wasn't until it sort of came further down the coast into New South Wales that it was actually discerned that there were 21 seamen on board who were suffering human rights violations, including wage theft. They'd collectively been owed over 100,000 Australian dollars. They also were their food and their water provisions, and there was a lack of medical, well, it was substandard, and there was also a lack of medical treatment for them. And so these were deemed to be human rights violations. As a result, the ship was banned from Australian waters for 6 months. I raise this topic because we have a client who used Viva Energy as one of their main suppliers, and they were very interested to know what Viva Energy in particular, as well as Vital, had in place as the owner of the oil, and the charter company had in place around human rights due diligence. What was interesting about this situation is that these two entities and the main players in the space had all the right agreements in place. They had all the right policies and adherence to various maritime conventions, and yet somehow, unexplainably, the risk these men were found to be suffering human rights violations in the realm of modern slavery risk. And unfortunately, nothing has come to light really as to what the resolution was about that, right? Except that the Australian authorities banned the ship from Australian waters for 6 months. So that was the result of that situation. So really then, when it comes to addressing modern slavery due diligence, a lot of work has been done by organizations to, in a sense, get themselves set up over the last few years in terms of attending to their governance frameworks and their risk management frameworks. A lot of policies have been updated and with modern slavery inputs. There's been enterprise-wide training being conducted by many organizations, by most organizations, initial risk assessments and some attendance to actually social auditing of suppliers with various degrees of success and various degrees of, in a sense, intentionality in terms of how those audits are being done, has been noted by Siobhan. So, you know, the area of health and PPE is not alone. There are many industries in Australia where there needs to be a lot more work done particularly around collaborating with peers, collaborating with civil society groups, and really getting to the sort of the context of workplace exploitation. And that's really one of the key things that I think we need to consider. There's a great quote from Professor Justine Nolan and sorry, let me just bring that up for you. Actually, I might have the next screen. There it is. You know, modern slavery sits on a continuum of exploitation. It should not and cannot be addressed in isolation. In our bid to manage and reduce and eliminate modern slavery, we need to first acknowledge the larger contextual problems from which it emerges. We should treat the symptoms and the causes. And so one of the challenges here for many organizations in Australia is to actually get, you know, into the context of modern slavery risk and not just sort of view things from a sort of hypothetical or theoretical or even just based on algorithms, but actually with the appropriate goal setting, with the appropriate sort of executive sponsorship, with the appropriate level of resourcing and willingness to actually collaborate with other entities, with other stakeholders, for example, government, and with also civil society groups, with NGOs, to actually, in a sense, go out of their way to identify where the risks are and not be satisfied perhaps with the data sets that they're receiving, which are credible, but in terms of actually getting to the specifics, being prepared to drill down into the supply chain and work with suppliers and actually to get the information they need and to in a sense take a long-term view in doing so, really recognizing the complexity of modern slavery due diligence, and as per the example I gave around AG Neptune. So it's one of the challenges for organizations is to get down. As was noted, I think just briefly by Kelly, you know, we have the example of Xinjiang province in the west of China, where we have the alleged forced labor of Uyghur people groups. And the situation there, according to Dr. James Cockayne, who is the anti-slavery commissioner here in New South Wales, it's got to the situation in that province is such, it's very difficult for journalists and auditors to get into that province to actually verify modern slavery risks. And they, when they attempt to do so, they can actually be at risk of having their phone or their laptop or their equipment confiscated, and they might be fined and they might be mistreated themselves. And so we have a situation here where it's increasingly, as parts of the world are demanding transparency, and governments, for example, Australia, are demanding companies to be more transparent, we have situations where there's increased censorship in terms of the releasing of information, and that makes it incredibly difficult to actually verify where modern slavery risks are. An example of that could be that a product made in Xinjiang province may not leave that province directly to an overseas market, and actually in many cases be sent to other provinces in China for further processing and manufacturing and packaging, and finally the logistics and the shipping. And so it becomes increasingly difficult then for organizations to actually verify modern slavery risks, and that may lead to a reluctance to do more than that they would like, they can do. I think probably the limitations in terms of the restrictions around COVID have also made it very difficult for organizations to get into certain contexts to actually understand where those risks are. So I think there's been lots of factors at play in terms of understanding that, but really it's our perspective and the perspective of others, that there a lot more needs to be done to be much more intentional in addressing modern slavery risk and actually drilling down into the supply chain and taking that level of investment in partnership with other key stakeholders to actually understand where modern slavery risks occur. And this leads us to the second part, is around taking a stakeholder approach to addressing modern slavery risk. One of the challenges of the processing of data at a high level is that it can actually, as mentioned earlier, it can skew our interpretation of where the risks are and what the risks look like. It's only as actually we attend to the context of modern slavery risk that we can actually then start attending to the perspective of stakeholders, of those people who are actually at risk, who are in those contexts and who are most vulnerable. We can then begin to understand more of the specifics of what their situation is and what it is that we're actually looking at in terms of modern slavery risk. And that will help us in many ways to understand and unpack the distinctions between the different faces of modern slavery in terms of forced labor and bondage and human trafficking and domestic servitude, for example. That will help us to actually consider all the various indicators and the different types of modern slavery risk to actually give us a much clearer picture as we actually attend to those who are actually on the ground and are prepared to actually get down to the grassroots level of understanding risk. It's from there that we can then really start actually thinking through issues around remedy. As mentioned earlier, it's one thing to have a policy of remedy, of remediation. It's another thing to actually remediate effectively. And I think that as organizations then drill down and get to the specifics and the context of modern slavery due diligence, it is there that they'll actually be able to discern from those who are on the ground what actually remediation means for them. And that could be a range of things. For example, it could actually just do with the actual state of or that has to do with the environment within which they're working. It could do with making sure, for example, that when it comes to sanitation and personal hygiene, that a facility actually has adequate toilets, for example. It might actually, or facilities for women if it's in a factory and there's actually no toilets that separate the needs of both male and female, for example. It might actually have to do with many of those kind of low-hanging fruits around making sure that the machinery is actually safe, that they're actually operating from, that the air quality is satisfactory, that actually there's adequate waste management in the facility. And this is often where modern slavery and human rights issues dovetail with environmental considerations. So simply by actually making sure that people actually, that their needs are attended to and what is important for them to actually improve their, in a sense, their work situation. It's often said to me when I'm engaging with companies, what is, to what extent are we, in terms of doing modern slavery due diligence, imposing upon our values or imposing upon another jurisdiction the way that we think things should be done. And this is often in relation to wages. And the issue of wages can be quite tricky when we think about, we need to really think through what a living wage is for somebody and what actually enables them to actually live freely and to be able to make choices and to have some purchasing power in the context in which they're operating. So again, it's only through a real strong understanding of the context in which our products and services are being made that we can actually attend to the specifics of remedy and what's important to those two stakeholders in that space. And I think probably in summary then, we need to, in terms of modern slavery due diligence, what organizations need to do and do more of in partnership with each other and in partnership with organizations on the ground is actually to drill down, to actually get a better understanding of the context, work with stakeholders to actually understand what the risks are, and through that to actually work out what are the actual appropriate strategies and practices around providing remedy. There's probably a lot more I can say on that, but I'm just mindful of the time because we're running out of time. But that's a very short, very short summary and overview of the state of play.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. You've really well described for us how complex, obviously, these supply chains genuinely are, and how difficult it really can be for corporates, for businesses to actually know where they need to go seeking sort of the truth. But equally, how sometimes the legislative framework is also weakened by, as you say, these concepts like reasonable steps, which is a shame. And at the same time, of course, currently, as you've noted, other priorities maybe are more sort of at the front of the queue
more pertinent
in Australia.
Yes.
Meaning that, you know, maybe there's less attention being paid now to this type of modern slavery related due diligence. But anyway, it's not something that's going to go away.
No.
And finally, also really important that you pointed out the number of issues in relation to remediation. I, of course, took a bit of a narrow focus talking about compensation to workers, the issues really of unpaid wages. But you importantly also pointed out sort of like the softer approaches also to remediation in relation to the nature of the workplace at the start of things, the environment in which workers are working, access to facilities, etc., clean air, and all those type of things are obviously equally important. So thank you ever so much for that. That's been an excellent overview. One thing I did want to mention, actually, which I didn't at the start, was that this is recorded, this webinar. So if there's any aspects that you want to return to, it'll also be posted, obviously, on our website. So we'll be able to, people will be able to go back to that. If there's certain nuggets of information that you want to hear again, it'll be all there recorded for good or for bad. In terms of questions, I see that a couple of people have put some things in the chat. If there are any other questions that you want to put up there, we can maybe field a couple of questions. Let me just have a quick look. Okay, I see that somebody has asked so there's comments in relation to the fact that they're in total agreement in relation to that police anti-human trafficking organs don't really report on realities, and they don't give hard and appropriate data, and there are always uncoordinated efforts to safeguard victims. I think that sort of probably relates to some of the things that were being said about Malaysia as well, particularly with task forces on trafficking and then labour inspectorates. So thanks for that comment. The same participant would also like to know whether there are any recommendations in relation to the best methods to repatriate trafficked child victims. I think in relation to countries such as Burundi, Malawi or Congo, repatriation from those countries. He doesn't specify in what forms of possible labour these children have been trafficked into. So I'll leave that open for the moment in relation to whether either Kelly or Stephen might have some responses to that. I've got some of my own views on that. But just to go then to a final question, that we have all these anti-slavery exploitation laws, policies, etc. We have due diligence audits, yet slavery exploitation is still happening. So what really has to change to curb it, aside from these actions that we've already taken on board? Questions of someone from the Pearl of the Orient. Thank you very much for hosting the discussion. Okay, take it easy. All right, maybe coming to this last question. We've sort of tried to say this is how we should be trying to address some of these weaknesses, some of these challenges. Kelly, you in particular were saying, this is a turning point, obviously, in cannabis production, and you don't want to go down the same roads with the same bad practices as we've seen in other cash crops. Maybe you'd like to reiterate again what then can be done differently. And you also seem to suggest that Canada is going to maybe sort of forge a particular path of good practice in this regard. Maybe you can give us a little bit more detail as to maybe what that would entail.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there needs to be a multi-pronged approach. Everything has always been operating in silos, focusing on community as well as industry as well as government all together. And I think that if possible, maybe Canada can lead the way, maybe it will be another country first. But if there is something specific to a sector, that the governing regulations actually include labor protection, that will change overall behavior. Companies might be more incentivized to, because they will be audited regularly by governments, because it's such a highly regulated crop, that we could possibly see sector behavior change with incentive because it's baked into the regulations. So moving just beyond the advertising, marketing, packaging standards, what about the human standards? So I feel like we've not really seen a sector-based approach. Coffee is currently trying to operate more with a harmonized supply chain and work together as a sector, from the largest producers to the small independent farmers. So if we see them doing that now and backpedaling and changing their behavior, it would be silly for cannabis not to learn and do something cooperatively as a sector. So that gives me hope that there's a way we could do things differently. And yeah, like I said, I really think there needs to be more of a multi-pronged approach to tackling this, rather than it being, okay, NGOs focus on victim repatriation and government focuses on mandating that corporates only making 5 million plus are watched. Like, it just seems like a really broken system. So yes, I think I know where that question came from. In the Philippines, labor exploitation is rampant there. When I was speaking there about cannabis, they said, you know, there are so many boys working in Dole, De Monte, all the fruit and banana plantations, trafficked, smuggled. Why will cannabis be different? It's so real for them. They don't see it being different. Whereas here we're trying to wrap our heads around, oh, really? Would that happen? So I do see where this question was coming from. And I think that, you know, we have to do something differently and include all stakeholders.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. And maybe Stephen, do you have a few further insights as to what really will change this around?
Well, I think I'm not against modern slavery acts. Come on, Canada, get your act together. New Zealand, likewise. I think I think there are emerging legislations. France, Netherlands, Germany, European Union. The United States is taking action as well. So I think as more countries actually make this a priority and actually implement hard legislation and learn from each other. I think there's probably a lot that we could all learn from the French legislation, which I believe is one of the strongest in terms of actually what organizations are being asked to do. So I think there's more legislation, and then the expectation rate is raised really in terms of, well, this is not simply just to satisfy some client in Australia. This is actually something that I need to do for myself, for my own, because that's what my government requires. So I think, that together with a lot more education, awareness, and train capacity building, because I think, you know, what needs to really happen is a complete shift in the way we conduct business in the world. I mean, this impacts global economics. We've set up a structure over the last 80 years of how the world works economically, and it favors some and impoverishes many. So that is a huge driver in that poverty is a huge driver in terms of labor exploitation. And so we need to address that imbalance somehow. So that is beyond the scope of, that's beyond my remit. I'm not an economist, but I think really we need to encourage governments to do better, to put in laws in the more countries that actually have these reporting frameworks. Then it does actually create a greater level field for across the globe. I don't think that, but I think overall there's not just going to be one way that this is going to happen. It's going to be a it's multifactorial.
Okay, thanks both of you for those comments. In relation to repatriation of children, I don't know if any of you have experience of this. I mean, maybe even in the context of the sectors, for instance, cannabis sector, maybe Kelly, you've come across some of this. I don't know whether Stephen you have. Maybe just a couple of comments from my own experience working in countries in West Africa, for instance, although the question relates more to East Africa, but West African countries equally, I know, have had a lot of difficulties where, in fact, child trafficking tends to be the most sort of prominent form of trafficking, often for domestic work, also agricultural related labour and street selling and things like that, but that the repatriation of these children is always tricky. States often enter into bilateral agreements in relation to this so that they can actually take charge of repatriating children that are identified as victims of trafficking in that country. Sometimes these children are unaccompanied, or they are basically agents in their own right, in terms of that they have chosen to go to these countries and seek work. So sometimes that's made it more problematic in relation to even the purpose sometimes of actual repatriation to their home countries when they're seeking employment in a context where there's much more employment opportunities in maybe a neighbouring country. But I know that in many also situations, a lot of civil society organisations have actually made their own arrangements with their relevant embassy officials in the country of destination, and have had to sort of create ad hoc means of ensuring that children that might be identified in those destination countries have consular access, and then the embassy officials actually orchestrate the return of those children to origin countries. Sometimes in the context, obviously, of risk assessments in relation to it would be also, of course, in the best interest of the child, maybe to be returning that child to a family. Obviously, these type of standards set by also the Child's Rights Convention are all important in terms of trying to create more methodical schemes of return. But anyway, that's my particular experience in relation to that. So I don't know whether you want to add anything, Kelly or Stephen, in this.
It's not my area of expertise, so yeah. I can't comment.
I can't speak specifically to Congo, Malawi, this region, but I can say that in Southeast Asia, there are a few NGOs that are really the ones like at the helm leading the charge, that are the point person, like you said, Siobhan, connected to the embassy to make sure that there's a smooth flow. If there's a victim that's being repatriated, they also help with rehabilitation and the sort of re-assimilation process, because oftentimes, not only are they malnourished or sick, maybe they are hooked on drugs, and there's a process of sort of reintegrating them before they're ready to travel and go back home. But a great example of this would be the Labor Protection Network. If our participant wants to look them up, or I can put the link in. They're based out of Thailand, and they kind of cover Southeast Asia and do that really, really well. I'm sure there are organizations doing similar things within Africa, but yeah, you definitely need somebody who's on the ground, well connected at both the embassy level, and understand the issues in the cities to be able to help smoothly repatriate victims.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we've given our all for the last hour and a half. So I'd just like to thank you both ever so much, Kelly and Stephen, for being here today to present alongside me. I think it's been really informative. I've learned an enormous amount. I really do hope that our participants have. I thank all of you as well, particularly those who've endured the entire hour and a half. So those who are still with us, I know that some people obviously had to probably scoot off a little earlier, but I hope it's been informative for all of you too. And this won't be the last time, as I said. So please keep an eye on what we're doing next, and hope to meet some of you in future at the next webinar. And everything else, there's things still in the chat. I don't know whether the chat will remain for very long, because there's a couple of things pasted up there for you to look at, but otherwise, obviously, websites are always a good resource. Okay, so wishing you a good evening, Stephen, wishing you a good day, Kelly, and to everybody else, best of luck with the rest of your day. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great day. Good night. Take care.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.